The morning light fell in pale, dusty shafts through the narrow windows of the National Archive. Rows of silent shelves stood like sentinels, their wooden frames sagging under the weight of centuries. Most days here passed in a kind of muffled monotony. The slow shuffle of paper, the soft rasp of a brush clearing specks of time from fragile pages. But today, Clara Méndez's hand froze mid-turn over a leather-bound colonial diary. The paper was brittle, its edges curled like dry leaves, but what caught her eye were not the familiar colonial-era notations written in faded brown ink. No. Barely visible in the narrow margins ran a series of small, deliberate marks. They weren't letters, they weren't numbers, they were symbols. She leaned closer, holding her breath as though even the act of exhaling might erase them. Tiny clusters of dots, bars, and intricate curls, drawn so faintly they seemed almost shy. She knew these shapes. She had seen them in her private studies of Mayan glyphs, late nights with dusty grammar books and the patient guidance of a half-broken online dictionary. Yet these were different, grouped in a pattern that was both familiar and strange, like hearing an old song sung in a new key. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted the magnifying glass. The symbols repeated every few pages, with subtle variations, as though they were fragments of a longer message, scattered like breadcrumbs through the diary. And at the bottom corner of the final page there was something more. A faint sketch of a circular disc, its edge marked by radiating lines, and a shadow drawn across it. She swallowed hard. A shadow on the sun. Her mind churned. Could this be a reference to an eclipse? The Mayans were famed for their astronomical precision, but many of their recorded celestial events had been lost or destroyed. She thought of the Chilam Balam books, their cryptic prophecies often blending astronomy with legend. Could these hidden marks be something similar? A record of an eclipse that no one alive had ever known about? Her pulse quickened. If it were true, it would be more than just a historical curiosity. It would mean that somewhere in the chaos of conquest and conversion, a Mayan astronomer had preserved a secret, hidden it in the work of a colonial scribe, perhaps to keep it safe from destruction. And it would mean that modern astronomical history was incomplete. But Clara also knew this was dangerous ground. Archivists weren't meant to discover anything. Her job was to preserve, not interpret. She had seen colleagues quietly removed from their posts for letting curiosity blur the edges of procedure. Still, she couldn't stop herself. She gently copied the symbols onto a sheet of acid-free paper, tracing each mark with obsessive care. She'd take them home, compare them to known glyph catalogues, check against astronomical event databases. She would find out if this was real. Her thoughts wandered, unbidden, to her grandfather, a quiet man who had once shown her the night sky from the roof of their small house in Yucatan. He taught her the constellations not from a book, but from memory, handed down through the family. He told her stories of the Maya, how they read the heavens, how they wove time into cycles and patterns. He used to say, "The stars are just books written in light. You only have to learn the language." The language. That was exactly what she was holding now. A fragment of that star-written language hidden in plain sight. Clara's breath caught when she noticed something else. Alongside the sketch of the sun was a set of numbers in the Mayan vigesimal system. She jotted them down and without thinking began converting them into a Gregorian date. Her heart pounded as the numbers resolved into something startling. A date that did not match any recorded eclipse in the known astronomical catalogue. It was as if she had stepped into a shadow from the past, one stretching silently into the present. She didn't know it yet, but this moment, her leaning over that diary in the dusty archive, would set her on a path toward a discovery that would shake both history and science. She straightened, closing the diary gently, the symbols now burned into her mind. Somewhere out there, perhaps in another forgotten archive, or buried under jungle roots, the rest of this message waited for her. And she intended to find it. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Dr. Salazar's life. Outside, the sun dipped briefly behind a cloud, and the reading room dimmed. Clara noticed it, and for a fleeting second, she imagined the sky going completely dark as the Mayan code had promised. She shivered and turned the page. The rain had begun its soft percussion on the tin roof of Clara's small apartment, the rhythmic tapping like an impatient knock from the past. Her desk was cluttered with open books, each bristling with bookmarks and scraps of notepaper. The copied symbols from the colonial diary lay at the center, illuminated by the warm amber glow of her desk lamp. She had been cross-referencing them for hours, moving between old reproductions of the Dresden Codex, fragmented glyph indexes, and a battered notebook she'd kept since her university days. Most of her colleagues never bothered with glyph work. Too tedious, too uncertain, too heavy with the ghosts of interpretation. But for Clara, it was like tracing the brushstrokes of history itself. Tonight, something clicked. The repeating clusters in the margins were not random, she realized. They formed a sequence used by Mayan scribes to denote astronomical events, a combination of a day glyph, a lunar series, and what appeared to be the glyph for Keen, the sun. More astonishing still, the surrounding markings suggested movement, transition, and darkness. She exhaled sharply. This wasn't just a generic solar event. The pattern was too precise, too deliberate. Her fingers danced over her laptop keys as she opened an astronomical simulation program. She fed in the numbers from the diary, carefully adjusting for the Mayan long count calendar's correlation to the Gregorian system. The simulation spun forward through centuries, the virtual stars wheeling past until the date came into view. There it was. Not a single record in the modern astronomical catalogue matched it. Yet the simulation showed without question a total solar eclipse, the moon's shadow sweeping across the Yucatan Peninsula like a drawn blade. Clara leaned back, the reality of it making her skin prickle. A forgotten eclipse. She thought of the colonial scribe who must have copied these glyphs into the diary, either knowingly preserving them or unwittingly smuggling them past the eyes of church censors. And behind that scribe, further back in time, some Mayan astronomer standing in a temple courtyard, tracking the sun's slow journey toward a moment when daylight would vanish. The thought filled her with a reverence that was almost grief. She reached for her phone and hesitated. Who could she tell? Her colleagues at the archive would dismiss her, or worse, accuse her of tampering with restricted materials. The academic gatekeepers would demand access to the diary, and once they had it, she'd be written out of her own discovery. She knew how this worked. Her career, already precarious, could not withstand accusations of stepping outside her role. Archivists were custodians, not historians. She was supposed to clean and store the past, not rewrite it. Still, Her grandfather's words returned, low and insistent. The stars are just books written in light. You only have to learn the language. The next day, she slipped back into the restricted section of the archive. The diary was still where she had left it, the faint symbols safe in their quiet exile. She checked for any catalogue annotations that might connect it to other documents, and found one, a vague reference to a related volume stored off-site in the sealed colonial collection. That collection was rarely opened. She'd need special permission, and she knew she'd never get it through official channels. But she also knew the name of the only man who still had an informal key to the vault. Dr. Salazar, the retired head archivist. Salazar was a complicated figure, brilliant, temperamental, and famously dismissive of amateur theories. He was also fiercely protective of anything that might, in his view, be misinterpreted by the untrained. Convincing him would take more than charm. It would take proof. Clara copied the sequence of glyphs again, more neatly this time, and tucked the sheet into her notebook. She would go to Salazar's house that evening. She would show him the symbols and the simulation results, and she would try to make him see what she saw, that the past was not silent, only waiting for someone willing to listen. As she locked up her desk, she caught her reflection in the darkened window. There was something in her eyes she hadn't seen for years. Not just curiosity, but resolve. Outside, the rain had stopped. The night sky over the city was clear, stars scattered like distant fires. Somewhere among them was the path of that ancient eclipse, written in light and shadow. Clara knew she was on the edge of something enormous, and that once she stepped forward, there would be no turning back. The heavy, rust-colored door to the colonial vault loomed before Clara like the mouth of a cave. Even in the dim light of the sub-basement corridor, the old iron lock gleamed with a stubborn defiance. Few had crossed its threshold in the past decade, and those who had were escorted by armed guards during state-approved inspections. Dr. Salazar stood beside her, his long coat brushing the floor. He still carried himself with the authority of his former position, his silver hair swept back neatly, his dark eyes scanning the hall as if expecting an ambush. "You understand," he said quietly, "that I'm risking my entire pension for this." Clara nodded, clutching her leather-bound notebook to her chest. "And I'm risking my job." Salazar's gaze lingered on her face for a moment, searching for any sign of hesitation. Finally, he turned to the door, pulling a ring of ancient keys from his pocket. The metallic rattle seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. The lock protested with a long, grinding creak before yielding. The door opened to a rush of cold, stale air, carrying the faint scent of mold and dust. The smell of time locked away. Inside, the room was lined with towering wooden cabinets, each with small brass plates etched in spidery handwriting. Salazar moved with purpose, weaving between them until he stopped at a cabinet marked Volume 172, Ecclesiastical Records, Unclassified. He reached up, tugging down a box so heavy that Clara had to help him set it on the central table. When he lifted the lid, Clara's breath caught. Inside, wrapped in layers of yellowed linen, lay a Codex. Its bark paper pages bound by thin cords, the surface painted in the deep reds, blacks and ochres of traditional Mayan artistry. "This," Salazar said softly, "was confiscated by Spanish friars sometime in the late 1600s. It was mislabeled as a heretical tract and buried in the ecclesiastical records. No one has catalogued it since." Clara reached out, her gloved hands trembling as she peeled back the linen. The first page was alive with images: a sun disk, stylized jaguars, and rows of glyphs, some identical to those she had found in the diary. Her pulse quickened. She began turning pages carefully, scanning for the sequence she'd memorized. It appeared midway through the Codex, alongside illustrations of the moon and what appeared to be the phases of its journey. But there was more. An accompanying series of pictographs showing the sun being eaten by a great serpent, the sky darkening, and figures kneeling beneath a jagged horizon. "It's the same pattern," she whispered. "The same date markers, the same glyphs. This isn't just a note in the margins. This is the full record." Salazar's brow furrowed as he studied the page. "You're certain of your translation?" Clara opened her notebook, flipping to the carefully transcribed symbols from the diary, then to her printed simulation of the eclipse. She explained the astronomical alignment, the exact path of totality, and how it intersected with the sacred ceremonial centers. Salazar listened, his expression unreadable. Finally, he exhaled slowly. "If what you're saying is true, this would force historians to acknowledge a Mayan astronomical prediction that surpasses anything previously recorded. And that, Miss Méndez, will make enemies." His words were not a warning. They were a statement of fact. They worked in silence for the next hour, photographing and cataloguing the relevant pages without officially logging their work in the archive system. Every click of the camera felt illicit, every rustle of paper a trespass. As Clara carefully returned the Codex to its wrappings, she caught Salazar watching her. There was something softer in his gaze now, not approval exactly, but a recognition that she was not a mere custodian of relics. "She was a seeker. Whatever you choose to do next," he said quietly, "do it quickly, before someone else notices what you've found." They closed the vault and locked it behind them. But as Clara walked away, her mind was already racing toward the next step, bringing the Codex's prediction into the light, and with it, the forgotten voice of the Mayan astronomers who had written in the language of the stars. The afternoon sun turned the streets of the old quarter into a wash of gold and shadow as Clara followed Dr. Salazar into his cramped study. The place was a labyrinth of towering bookshelves, rolled maps, and dusty crates stacked to the ceiling. The air smelled of leather, ink, and the faint medicinal tang of old paper. Salazar gestured toward an armchair half buried beneath a pile of journals. Clara cleared them away and sat, placing her notebook in her lap. The Codex's photographed pages were still vivid in her mind. The serpent devouring the sun, the kneeling figures, the precise glyphs spelling out a date lost to modern astronomy. Salazar poured 2 glasses of water and settled opposite her, his sharp gaze unblinking. "I've been thinking about your find," he began, "and about what it means." Clara braced herself. "This isn't just about a lost eclipse," he said. "If we publish this, we won't just be challenging astronomical records. We'll be confronting centuries of narrative, one written by colonial powers that systematically erased indigenous knowledge. You are proposing to restore a piece of that knowledge, and they will not thank you for it." She swallowed. "But isn't that the point? To bring the truth back into the light?" He leaned forward, his voice low. "Truth, yes. But you need to understand, truth is a dangerous currency. It draws attention from those who profit from the way things are, and they have the resources to bury both the discovery and the person who made it." Clara hesitated, the weight of his words settling over her like a lead cloak. She thought of her modest apartment, her temporary contract at the archive, her quiet life that no one outside her small circle noticed. She had nothing to shield her if the wrong people decided she was a threat. "Why tell me this now?" she asked. Salazar's expression softened, just slightly. Because I see myself in you. 30 years ago, I uncovered documents proving that a major colonial expedition had fabricated its victory over a Mayan city. I thought the truth would speak for itself. Instead, the university shut me out, the funding dried up, and the papers disappeared into private collections. I survived by keeping my head down. The bitterness in his tone was unmistakable, but so was the glimmer of something else. Regret. "Do you regret finding it?" she asked. "No," he said immediately. "I regret not protecting it better. And I regret thinking that the truth alone was enough." They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the old ceiling fan filling the room. Finally, Salazar spoke again. "If you insist on pursuing this, you will need allies. People who can give the discovery legitimacy and visibility before it can be buried. That means astronomers, historians, even journalists who aren't afraid of controversy." Clara nodded slowly, her mind already turning over names. Former professors, a friend in the university's astrophysics department, an independent journalist who specialized in suppressed archaeological stories. Salazar studied her for a long moment. "You're not going to walk away from this, are you?" She met his gaze. "Would you?" He smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "No. But then, I'm an old man with nothing to lose." When she left his study, the sun had dipped low, casting the narrow streets in deep, dramatic shadow. Clara walked slowly, feeling the weight of the photographs in her bag, the knowledge in her mind, and the silent ticking of a clock she could almost hear. The eclipse date was fixed, an unchanging truth written in the movements of the heavens. But the forces that would try to suppress it were far more unpredictable. And as she turned onto her street, Clara realized something else. She was no longer simply uncovering history. She was stepping into a conflict that had been smoldering for centuries. And now she carried the spark that could set it ablaze. The jungle greeted Clara with a wall of humid heat, the air thick with the mingled scents of earth and orchids. She stepped off the battered bus onto a gravel road that shimmered under the midday sun. Before her, the dense green swallowed the horizon, save for the stone silhouettes of a half-excavated Mayan temple jutting like teeth from the foliage. The site wasn't on the official tourist maps. It had been abandoned by a university excavation team a decade ago after funding cuts, leaving the temples, plazas and carved stelae to the creeping vines and the call of howler monkeys. But for Clara, it was more than ruins. It was the place the Codex had named, the place where the serpent was said to have swallowed the sun. She adjusted the strap of her pack and stepped onto the narrow trail. The sound of cicadas pulsed around her like the beating of unseen drums. Each step forward felt like crossing deeper into the Codex's world, a place where the sky was an altar and time itself was counted in shadows. Her local guide, a wiry man named Matteo, led the way. He spoke little, but his machete spoke for him, slicing through overgrowth with practiced ease. From time to time, he glanced over his shoulder, eyes narrowing at the clouds building on the horizon. "You came a long way for some old rocks," he finally said. "They're not just rocks," Clara replied. "They're history, and maybe the key to rewriting it." Matteo said nothing, but his mouth twitched, whether in skepticism or respect, she couldn't tell. By late afternoon, they reached the central plaza. Massive limestone blocks lay in silent arrangement, their carved surfaces worn, but still bearing faint traces of glyphs and celestial symbols. Clara's breath caught when she saw it, a carved panel depicting the serpent devouring the sun, nearly identical to the one in the Codex. Above it were 4 glyphs, the same date sequence she had traced from the diary. She crouched, brushing away leaves and soil, her fingers trembling. The placement matched her calculations. From here, on the day of the ancient eclipse, the sun would have been directly overhead, only to vanish as the moon's shadow consumed it. But the sky above was changing. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of ozone. The distant rumble of thunder grew louder. Matteo straightened, scanning the darkening clouds. "Storm," he said. "We need to leave." "Just a little longer," Clara pleaded, adjusting her compass and checking the azimuth. She wanted to be certain, needed to be certain. The first raindrops fell heavy and warm, splattering the stone. Thunder cracked, closer now, and the trees around the plaza swayed violently. The storm seemed to arrive all at once. Wind howling through the ruins, rain hammering the earth, lightning illuminating the jagged outlines of the temple. Matteo grabbed her arm. "We can't stay here. It's dangerous." But Clara's eyes were locked on the serpent carving, now slick with rainwater. In the flashes of lightning, it seemed almost alive, its open mouth a portal to the darkening sky. She thought of the ancient astronomer who had stood here centuries ago, watching the same sky churn with shadow. A bolt of lightning struck somewhere beyond the tree line, the crack of it echoing like a gunshot. Matteo's grip tightened. "Now!" he barked. They sprinted toward a half-collapsed structure at the edge of the plaza, taking shelter beneath its leaning roof. Rain poured through gaps in the stone, running in rivulets down the walls. Clara clutched her notebook to her chest, protecting it from the water. For hours they waited. The storm raged without pause, the roar of rain drowning out all other sounds. In the flicker of Matteo's flashlight, Clara traced the glyph sequence again, feeling its weight. This place was more than a ruin. It was a message carved in stone, a testimony to an event so precise and so important that the Mayans had embedded it in their most sacred architecture. When the rain finally eased, night had fallen. The jungle was a chorus of dripping leaves and distant animal cries. They would have to camp here until morning. Clara lay awake, listening to the water patter on the stones, her mind replaying the day's images. She had the proof she needed, but she also felt something else now, the presence of a story far older and deeper than she had imagined. The eclipse wasn't just an astronomical prediction. It was part of a prophecy, and she had just stepped into it. The morning after the storm broke crisp and clear, the air washed clean by the rain. A thin mist clung to the ruins, curling around the temple stones as if reluctant to let go. Clara emerged from the shelter, stretching sore muscles and feeling the damp weight of her clothes. Matteo was already awake, crouched by a small fire, boiling water for coffee. "Today, you show me why you came," he said simply, handing her a steaming tin cup. She nodded, opening her notebook. The Codex's eclipse glyphs, the serpent motif, the date sequences. They were all here, laid out in neat ink. But what mattered now was the geometry. Clara set up her compass and protractor on a flat stone, using her calculations from the night before. The path of the ancient eclipse began to take shape before her, a swath of shadow that would have moved across the Yucatan Peninsula, cutting directly over this very site. She overlaid the temple's orientation and found it aligned perfectly with the sun's position at the moment of totality. "It's like they built this entire structure as a clock for that single moment," she murmured. Matteo peered over her shoulder. "And why would they do that?" Clara hesitated. In Mayan cosmology, eclipses weren't just natural events. They were messages from the gods, omens, sometimes warnings. She flipped to a page of the Codex photographs. There, beneath the serpent swallowing the sun, a line of glyphs described a great reckoning, a cleansing of the earth after the sky's mouth closed. Some scholars might call it poetic metaphor, but paired with the precision of the astronomical calculations, it suggested something more deliberate. "What's this?" Matteo asked, pointing to a glyph cluster she hadn't translated yet. She squinted at it, tracing the shapes with her finger. It was an emblem glyph, a kind of place name. She cross-referenced it with her glyph dictionary and felt her breath catch. "It says, 'Place of the blood sky,'" she whispered. That's here." Matteo's gaze sharpened. "People in my village still use that name. Old stories say the sky turned red here once. My grandfather told me it happened before his grandfather's time." A chill ran down Clara's spine. Oral history, carrying the echo of an event centuries past. She turned back to her diagrams. If the Codex's date was correct, the eclipse would not only have passed over this place, it would have painted the sky in the same way, the reddened light of the sun filtering through the moon's shadow, just as the old stories described. She began sketching the eclipse path onto a modern map, her pencil scratching urgently. The line cut across several other ancient sites, each known for ceremonial significance. It was as though the eclipse had been a unifying celestial event, witnessed by multiple kingdoms and perhaps coordinated through a shared astronomical calendar. "This was never just about predicting an eclipse," Clara said aloud. "It was about binding the kingdoms under one moment in time, a prophecy tied to the sky." Matteo studied her face. "If that's true, you found something no outsider has ever understood." Her hands stilled over the notebook. Outsider. The word stung. She thought of Salazar's warning about those who wouldn't want this knowledge revealed. But she also thought of the Mayan astronomer who had etched these calculations into stone and bark paper, ensuring they would survive fire, conquest, and centuries of neglect. The sun rose higher, burning away the mist. Clara stood and faced the temple, imagining the shadow racing toward it on that ancient day. She felt the hairs on her arms lift, as though some fragment of that long-ago moment still clung to the place. "This path," she said quietly. "It wasn't meant to stay buried. Someone wanted it to be found." Matteo glanced toward the tree line. "Then you'd better be ready. Because if you found it, others will come looking. And not all of them will want to share." The weight of his words settled in her chest. But instead of fear, she felt a strange calm. The path of the shadow was fixed, written into the movements of the heavens, and so was hers now. The weeks that followed moved with the relentless pull of a tide. Word of Clara's research spread quietly at first to a sympathetic astronomer at the university, then to a journalist who specialized in cultural heritage, and finally to a small group of indigenous scholars who had been working for decades to reclaim Mayan scientific history. Together they planned something audacious: to witness the eclipse exactly as the Codex had predicted, at the very site where the serpent devoured the sun. By the morning of the appointed day, the remote plaza was alive with movement. Portable telescopes stood like sentries along the temple's edge, their lenses trained on the brilliant sky. Historians, local elders, camera crews, and curious villagers gathered, murmuring in anticipation. Some wore traditional woven garments, the reds and blues glowing in the morning light. Clara moved through the crowd, clutching the Codex photographs and her weathered notebook. She could feel the tension in the air, an unspoken awareness that they were all about to witness something that had not happened here in centuries. Matteo stood near the temple steps, speaking in low tones with a group of village elders. The sun climbed higher, bright and merciless. Clara checked her watch. The calculated time of first contact was minutes away. A hush spread through the crowd as the first sliver of the moon edged across the sun's face. The change was subtle at first, a dimming that the untrained eye might miss. But Clara felt it in her bones. The light shifted, the shadows sharpened unnaturally, and the air grew cooler. Someone began to hum softly, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to rise from the stones themselves. An elder knelt before the serpent carving, his hand resting gently on the weathered limestone. Around them, the plaza fell silent, except for the whir of camera shutters and the rustle of wind through the trees. Halfway to totality, the light took on an eerie metallic hue, as though the world were being dipped in tarnished silver. Clara's heart pounded. This was exactly as the Codex described, the blood sky phase yet to come. And then it happened. The last bead of sunlight, the diamond ring, winked out, and the sky collapsed into darkness. A collective gasp swept the plaza. The temperature plunged. Above them, the sun was a black disk ringed with an otherworldly corona, a pale halo stretching into the void. Clara's throat tightened. She had seen eclipses in photographs, in simulations, but nothing could compare to this. It was as though the sky itself had opened a doorway to another realm. The crowd stood frozen, their faces bathed in the strange twilight, each person alone with their awe. A deep red glow emerged along the horizon, encircling them. The blood sky of legend. Clara turned slowly, taking it all in. The temple's alignment with the eclipsed sun, the serpent carving now alive in shadow and firelight, and the silent tears running down the face of an elderly woman beside her. In that moment, she felt the full weight of what the ancient astronomers had achieved. Without telescopes, without satellites, they had calculated this moment so precisely that it could be rediscovered centuries later, and not just as a feat of science, but as a ritual, a living thread binding past to present. The totality lasted only a few minutes. When the first sliver of sunlight returned, the crowd broke into applause, cheers, and the rhythmic beat of drums. But Clara didn't join in. She stood still, her eyes locked on the sky, as if trying to memorize the feeling in her very bones. Somewhere deep inside, she knew this was more than the end of a prediction. It was the beginning of a reckoning, not just for the history books, but for everyone who believed the past could be silenced. As the light returned in full, Matteo appeared at her side. "Now they will listen," he said quietly. Clara nodded, but she wasn't so sure. People would listen, yes, but what they heard would depend on what they wanted to believe. And the fight for the truth was only just beginning. 3 weeks after the eclipse, Clara sat in the quiet reading room of the archive, sunlight spilling across the long wooden table. Before her lay a freshly printed journal article, the first official publication of the Codex's eclipse prediction, co-authored with the indigenous scholars and the university astronomer. Her name sat in small type beneath theirs, but it was there. The proof was in the open now, far beyond the reach of any single institution to hide. The photographs of the Codex had been released alongside the article, accompanied by high-resolution scans of the serpent carving at the temple. Within hours of publication, the story had spread, first through academic circles, then through cultural heritage groups, and finally into mainstream news. Not everyone celebrated. A government official had called the archive director within days, questioning the security of restricted materials and hinting at investigations. Clara had been summoned to a tense meeting where the director reminded her of her employment contract, his tone balancing between bureaucratic caution and thinly veiled irritation. But the tide had shifted. The eclipse had been witnessed by too many people, recorded in too many places. Videos of the blood sky ceremony had gone viral, interwoven with interviews from local elders and scholars. The narrative had escaped the walls of the archive, and it belonged to the people now. She closed the journal and leaned back, remembering the day at the ruins. The darkness, the red horizon, the stunned silence of hundreds as the sun vanished. That moment had burned itself into her, deeper than ink, deeper than fear. Across the table, Dr. Salazar appeared in the doorway, leaning on his cane. "I thought you'd like to know," he said.
The Ministry of Culture has agreed to fund a joint preservation project at the site, indigenous-led. Your name came up, in a positive way. Clara's chest tightened. "That's incredible," he smiled faintly. "You did what I couldn't. You kept it in the light." They spoke for a while about logistics, digitizing the Codex, training local archivists, protecting the site from looters. But beneath it all, there was a quiet understanding. The battle wasn't over. Knowledge could still be twisted, misused, or quietly undermined. The difference now was that more eyes were watching. Later, as Clara walked home through the late afternoon streets, she found herself pausing before a small park. Children were playing, their laughter ringing in the air, and one boy was holding a scrap of cardboard over his face, pretending it was a telescope. She smiled, and in that moment she thought of the ancient astronomer who had first calculated the eclipse. They had written their knowledge in glyphs and symbols, trusting it would endure. It had taken centuries, but their voice had reached across time. She had simply been the one to listen. At home, Clara placed the printed article on her desk beside her grandfather's old star charts. She touched the brittle paper edges, hearing his voice in her memory. "The stars are just books written in light. You only have to learn the language." She understood now that the language wasn't just numbers or symbols. It was the act of passing knowledge forward, of refusing to let it be silenced. The sun was setting outside, its light casting long golden beams through her window. Clara stood there for a long time, watching the horizon darken. The first stars emerging in the indigo sky, she felt no triumph, only a deep, steady peace. History, she realized, wasn't something you found. It was something you protected. Moral. Truth is more than discovery. It is preservation. Knowledge, like the sun, must be shielded from shadow if it is to shine for those yet to come. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.